Can you taste the difference in wine grown on slate versus volcanic versus granite soils? Most people think that soil doesn't matter, that it's all a marketing ploy. Here I sit down with Kevin Wenck from WUST Imports, who has sourced wine for years all across these different soil types in Europe. He'll tell you exactly how limestone, granite, volcanic, and slate soils bring different flavor profiles to wine. So if you ever wonder why Riesling is so mineral or why Burgundy is so distinctive, this conversation is for you. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. This is Igor, and I will be joined by my co-host, Kevin Wenck, and we are going to be talking dirt, forms of soil. All right, Kevin, thank you for joining me. Hey, Kevin, before we get started, I wanted to ask you this. Has anybody ever told you that you look like LL Cool J?
I've heard Richard Nixon, but I try to forget that. And there's some other sort of uncomplimentary other suggestion of some like dorky actor, but I don't remember who that is. But thank you very much. I'll look into that. LL Cool J. Yeah.
In that honor, maybe we'll have some LL Cool J as a background music to our little discussion.
Yeah. Well, we continue the theme of myth busting around wines. The last time we got together, we were effectively talking about silly ways that people try to get you to buy wine.
Yes.
And I don't even want to go into many of the details we discussed there, but one of the funny things to me,
box stores. That was like
the
methodology, that they use.
Yeah, but all the different marketing ploys that people use to try to make you think this is such a wonderful wine. And one that I continually see in solicitations, for me to keep track of what a lot of people are doing in the business, I personally sign up for the email lists of all these people who are selling wine online or whatever. And one of the stupidest phrases I think I see is another rock star wine from so-and-so.
Yeah.
These people are such gods that they can just wave magic wands and create these magical elixirs. Well, the real rock stars are not the winemakers. Yeah. It's the rocks. Yeah, because most of what you're actually tasting, unless a wine has been, I'll put it this way, modified with a lot of new oak barrels, or what I would call designer yeasts that are designed to, impart flavor and aroma characteristics in wines. Most of what you are tasting in wines comes from the minerality in the soil. And, in fact, one of the reasons why, in my opinion, that here in Northern California, we have a particular style with a lot of new oak being used is, even though this is a great environment for growing grapes, almost perfect weather all through the growing season, and that's rarely seen in any grape growing region on earth.
Yeah.
But you go up to Napa Valley. It's pretty, but it's basically flat farmland in the middle of the valley.
Yeah.
All the minerals in those soils have leached out long ago.
Yeah.
So in California, the style transitioned to let's use a lot of new oak. Let's use specific yeasts which impart flavor and aroma characteristics. But in other areas that have a lot of natural minerality in the soil, you don't need to do that because you get all these.
Jump in for a second. So you're talking about so I think some people sometimes see term commercial yeast versus like native yeast or indigenous yeast. I think that's what you're alluding to, right? California use a lot of these commercial yeast to impart flavor versus a lot of these European winemakers, especially the small family-owned farms, they typically use native yeast when they do winemaking.
Yeah, as some tired grape picker found out somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, after picking a bunch of clusters of grapes and then forgetting about them, he came back, a day or two later and found that they were fermenting. And what causes grapes to naturally ferment is there are ambient yeasts in the environment, and they will start the fermentation process spontaneously. One thing I'd like to clarify, though, about cultured yeast is you can have what are completely neutral cultured yeasts that add no flavor or aroma characteristics at all. But, as the wine industry is continually looking for new ways to sell you wine, there's also a lot of activity developing, specific, strains of cultured yeast that do add aromas or flavors.
Yeah.
But when you're in areas of high minerality, you don't need to do that. And that's why you find a lot more naturally fermented wines in Europe too, because you're getting all these interesting characteristics from the minerals in the soil itself. And then, you've got the ambient yeasts in the area, and it creates what in combination, a lot of people, would call terroir. It's the characteristics that you typically get in a wine from those regions. And, I look at the basic minerality, as 4 principal rock types. You've got slate, which in my opinion, gives you sort of deeper penetrating flavors, persistence on the palate. You've got granite. Anybody who likes to hike in the great outdoors has probably hiked in some rocky areas, and maybe you stopped by a mountain stream at one point and drank some fresh water out of the mountain stream. I mean, you're drinking water that's coming from a granitic environment, and it tastes refreshing to you. And so from granite, you get wines that have this sort of freshness to them, this purity to them, sort of precision to them. And then you're going on from there. You've got a lot of areas that, particularly Italy, that have volcanic activity. What I get from wines that are grown in volcanic soils, is sort of this depth of flavor, and that it accentuates the different native varietals. I mean, Italy is fascinating itself because you have probably 200 native varietals that are being made into wine in any meaningful quantities, and then you've got the the volcanic soil in Italy that then accentuates the intrinsic flavor characteristics. I mean, one of the more interesting things to me, one of my favorite grapes is Sangiovese, and although there are people in California that are making good Sangioveses, boy, the Sangioveses out of Italy taste very, very different than the Sangioveses produced in California. Because again, in California, you're kind of growing it on flat farmland. So you've got to do some things to it, to make it fully express itself. In Italy, littered with all these volcanoes, you didn't need to do anything to it. You get, the richer, deeper flavors, and also, what I would, normally experience as what I call a saturated finish, where the back part of your mouth is just sort of like coated with all these minerals, from the wine coming out of volcanic soils. And then the fourth one I'm gonna mention is sorry here.
Limestone.
My notes every day. Limestone. Which is actually my favorite. Limestone, is formed from sedimentary deposits that have been exposed to a lot of moisture and compression. And limestone has somewhat different characteristics than what I described with some of the others. But for me, any wines grown in a limestone terroir, they're refreshing to my palate. It's almost like having a granite between courses at a at a multi-course meal or something. And then also, as somebody who likes to cook, to me, the limestone, it accentuates the flavors in the food. It really just brings alive the flavors in the food. Now, all this sounds, conceptually interesting, but, how do you then add to your enjoyment of wine from all this? Well, let me go back to my notes again here. And at this time of night, I forget things. I'm at an advanced age too, so that contributes. But slate, where are you going to find this? So mainly people think of it in Germany. The principal parts in Germany are very steep river banks, particularly in the Rheingau, where the Rhine goes through, and then in the Moselle, where of course the Moselle goes through. and but there's another interesting part of Europe where you have, and also in the Moselle and the Rheingau, it's mainly Riesling, although there's some Pinot Noir grown in the Moselle or in the Rheingau that's also really remarkable Pinot Noir. It's the only place on earth really that slate is used to grow Pinot Noir. But northeastern Spain, in the region of the Priorat, and then on the north side of Montsant, you also have a lot of slate. My Montsant producer, northeastern Spain is also Catalonia, where the native language is Catalan, and my Montsant producer, Cingles Blaus. Well, what on earth does that mean? In Catalan, it means blue cliffs. And so walking through the vineyards, you look up at the ridges, and the rock faces of the ridges are all blue. And so that's why this particular producer decided to call his winery Cingles Blaus, blue cliffs, and in Catalan. But I described that from slate, you get this persistence across the palate, and then sort of deeper penetrating flavors. And in northeastern Spain, they're mainly growing Garnacha and Carignana, or Grenache and Carignan. And those reds, to me, have the same mouthfeel as when I'm drinking Rieslings, from Germany. And so I'm like, God, this is fascinating. So again, as I described earlier, in an industry where people are trying to hype this and hype that and talk about rock star winemakers, you've got two completely different grape types, not just white and red, but I mean, frankly, there is just no similarity at all in the characteristics of Riesling, regardless of it being a white, and the characteristics of Grenache or Carignan. And to taste the same thing across my mid palate, from both of those wines. I mean, that's pretty interesting. And then, Granite. To sum up slate, mainly in Germany and the Rheingau and the Moselle, and then northeastern Spain and the Priorat, and Montsant. And we get to Granite. And, Granite is present in a lot of different places.
Kevin, can I, before we get to Granite, so obviously you mentioned those are some of the most, famous wine regions. The Moselle makes legendary Rieslings, and obviously Grenache from Priorat. But I don't know, what is your, because there's different, like you were mentioning blue, but Priorat is known for their black slates versus the Moselle has, I think, blue slate and red slate. So you've been to those regions. So is it just like the pigmentation of the soils, or is there different characteristics to the different colors of the slate soils?
It will relate to the other minerals present in the area. The red slates are in areas where there's been significant iron deposits. And so those iron deposits have leached into the slate in the evolutionary process of the geology of those areas. And iron is interesting too, because iron really brings out the flavor in a wine. And I've got an interesting Pinot Noir from the Rheinhessen. There's a area in the eastern side of the Rheinhessen, right next to the Rhine River. It's called the Roter Hang. In German, it's red slope. And the Pinot Noirs in that area just have this rich, deep, penetrating flavors that are similar to Vaux Romanys, and from Burgundy. And Burgundy itself is fascinating because what you have in Burgundy is this roughly 30-mile long stretch that, of course, now is flat, but it was originally a sedimentary, ocean bottom. And, through eons, all these different layers of materials, settled layer by layer by layer by layer by layer, all these different minerals, in each subsequent layer. And then some, geologic event at one point takes this sedimentary ocean bottom and just turns it 90 degrees, where it's now flat, and each of these layers is now in a 30-mile stretch across Burgundy. That's why in Burgundy, you can basically go mile by mile, and the wines taste different.
Yeah.
It's all Pinot Noir for the reds.
Yeah.
It's all Chardonnay for the whites.
Yeah.
But mile by mile, they will taste different.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Wait, that's
I mean,
famous for. Yeah.
yeah, and then that's what's just delightful and really intriguing about Burgundy.
Yeah.
And you've got this one little pocket right in the middle of the Côtes de Nuits of Vosne Romani, where you've got Domaine Romani Conti,
Yes.
and you get all these iron deposits,
Yeah.
in the Vosne Romanis in particular. Yeah, and which is similar to then what you get from the Roter Hang, in the Rheinessen. So red slates would come from areas where there were significant iron deposits, which then accentuates sort of the rich penetrating flavors in the wines.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I say, unless you're going to mask all this with a lot of new oak,
yes,
and cultured yeast, I mean, you're basically tasting the rocks in the wines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes you do taste it. That's why it's so beautiful to just taste wines from all these places. But even more so, it's these kind of sub-regions within the places. The micro area, the terroir, like you mentioned. It's just how a particular piece of land just gives you a unique expression of a wine. Yeah.
That's why I think wine is the most interesting consumer product.
Yeah.
I mean, you think particularly with the world dominated by huge companies, and how do you make more money? Well, first you sell more stuff, and secondly, you create a more uniform product, so you've got lower production costs.
Yep.
But, it's sort of the way to fight back about that. Drink more wine, get more adventurous, explore.
Well, last episode, right? I mean, some of the bigger companies and conglomerates, they're trying to do that with the cultured yeast. They're trying to make more uniform wine, and that's where we try to bust this myth that it's not a commodity. It's artistic product. I don't know if a better way of saying that.
Yes. Going on to the next mineral type and the areas that it is. I just described granite, where I sense this sort of like purity and freshness and precision in the wines, and granite's everywhere. I mean, other than it's like flat farming areas, anywhere that there have been some mountains, you're going to find some granite. And the more prominent regions that people are probably better acquainted with, the northern Rhone. As the Rhone goes farther and farther north, it cuts this V-shaped valley, and there is just nothing but granite on either side, of that valley. And, Syrah, which has kind of like, a mixed audience. There's some people that love it, some people that hate it. But Syrah expressed in the granite of the Northern Rhone is just spectacular.
Yeah.
And sort of the deep flavors and the spiciness of Syrah, it's sort of enriched by the granite soil and adds the precision and the purity that I'm describing that you typically get out of granite. But, some other areas, Alsace is pretty interesting. I think in general people look at wine regions as having fairly uniform characteristics, but Alsace is about 50 miles from north to south. And southern Alsace has a lot more granite. Northern Alsace, as you move, towards the Pfalz region in Germany, which has some volcanic components in the soil, has, some volcanic aspects to it. And so, people look at, Alsatian wines as kind of this, obscure region that they don't know all that much about. But in my experience, the wines taste pretty different from the southern part of Alsace, where you've got much more granite, to the northern part of Alsace, where you've got volcanic influences. And then other regions where you've got the granite, southern Rhone, typically kind of flatter farmland, alluvial river valleys, but you've got some mountains to the east of the southern Rhone. In fact, a wine you tasted today, the Ventoux Blanc.
Yes.
So Mont Ventoux is the tallest mountain in southern France.
Yeah.
It's about 4,500, or in the southern Rhone, about 4,500 feet in elevation. My producer is about midway up the slope of Mont Ventoux, you walk through the vineyards, big chunks of rocks, and you taste a lot more minerality and freshness in that guy's wine than you taste in the white Southern Rhone wines that are grown in the flatter farmland. Yeah. Some other areas with a lot of granite. Roussillon, in the Languedoc-Roussillon area, you have the Pyrenees, that divide, France from Spain. Yes. And Roussillon is the southernmost area right next to the Pyrenees and what's overall called Languedoc-Roussillon. And you again taste sort of the purity and the freshness and the precision of a lot of wines from Roussillon.
Let me jump in. What you mentioned is very interesting. When we were talking about Slate, you were mentioning Priorat versus Monsant, and now you Northern Rhone versus Roussillon. And both of them have the same soils, but one region, Priorat, for example, that's the world-renowned regions, and the wines are expensive from that region. Whereas Monsant, you can get some great deals because it's kind of yet undiscovered area that makes very interesting wines from the same black slate soils that Priorat is famous for. And just the same way, obviously. The prices for Northern Rhone wines, the Conrotis or the Hermitages are, out of this world. Whereas Roussillon, you could get probably the best values in the whole wine world if they come from a particular plots of land in that region. So as in the Northern Rhone, the wines are almost 100% Syrah. And where in Roussillon, the typical blend is like 50% Syrah, and then Grenache and Mourvedre and some Carignan. Yeah. But you can still taste the expression of that Syrah grown in the granitic soils of Roussillon, as you do in the granitic soils of the Northern Rhone. Right. And so that's why I effectively just travel around Europe looking for soil types. And because I know how those soil types will express themselves in the wine. Unfortunately, it sometimes takes a while to then find wines that are true to that expression, because another unfortunate part of this business is you've got all these consultants wandering around trying to tell people what their wines need to taste like so they can sell more of them. And that ruins, everything of what we're talking about. To me, I just want to taste the grapes. Yeah. I mean, other people may want a different experience with wine, and if they do, I respect that. But, it's really fascinating to explore the differences in terms of how all these grapes then express themselves in all these different soil types. No, absolutely.
Yeah. And then, Italy is thought of as mainly a volcanic area, but there's a lot of granite in Italy too. Northern Italy, bordering the Alps, Alto Adige, Valtellina, Val d'Aosta. You've got a lot of granite in all of those wines. You definitely taste it. But even, mid to southern peninsula, you have the southern, Apennines coming down the peninsula, and there's some volcanic influences, affecting them too. But those are all granite mountains. Yeah. So, in areas of central Campania, you've got, similar granitic, tasting wines as you have up in the Alps.
And central Campania, can you give a little more specific, what area? Are we talking about white grapes? You're not talking about Aglianico, because I think that's mostly on volcanic soils of Campania.
Well, it depends on where it's grown, and I have both a Falangina and an Aglianico that's grown in what's called the Sannio Hills around Beneventano. Yes. And I mean, they have all these granite characteristics to them, where then merely 30 miles away, I have some wines that are grown on Mount Vesuvius, that have, just all these volcanic characteristics. And the volcanic characteristics, as I mentioned before, sort of like richer, deeper flavors, this like fully saturated finish. In one area of Italy, that, is not as well known, even though you've got, one of the world's great cities right in the middle of the area, but it's Lazio. Rome is surrounded by volcanoes, and I've done really well with my Lazio wines. People have never even heard of them. And, it's like they taste, these just really expressive flavors, and it comes from all the volcanoes that, had surrounded Rome. There's this one producer about 40 miles north of Rome on the north shore of what's called Lago Bolsena. And Lago Bolsena is formed from the collapsed caldera of an ancient volcano, and it's about 15 miles north to south and about 10 miles from east to west. So you can just imagine how huge this volcano must have been. But you go down to the shore of Lago Bolsena, black sand beaches. Yeah. And I'm not talking like gray sand. Yeah. I'm talking about dark black sand beaches on the shoreline of Lago Bolsena. And, the wines from that area then have all the characteristics that I've described in terms of the deep penetrating flavors and the fully saturated finish.
Well, very nice. So, let's should we just transition more into volcanic soils? You were mentioning earlier how limestone is your favorite. I would probably have to say that, tasting wines over the last, year and a half, volcanic soils might be my favorite wines right now. There's some spectacular wines from all different parts of the world growing volcanic soils that just have this particular minerality or salinity to it, and kind of this depth that's hard to replicate from other, I think, soils.
Yeah, in fact, one of the more interesting expressions of it that I've seen in my portfolio is, there was some volcanic activity, in southern in southwestern Germany, starting from the southern part of the Pfalz region. The Pfalz region in Germany is not as well known, but it's basically midway between Alsace in France and the Rheingau, or where Frankfurt is, in Germany. And the northern part of the Pfalz region, has, some limestone characteristics. The southern part of the Pfalz region, it's more volcanic soil, and then all the way down, at the southwest corner of Germany in Baden, you also have a lot of volcanic soil. And, you've had some of the Z-Reisen Pinot Noirs in your shop, and you can taste, those just kind of penetrating, brooding, almost haunting flavors that come from those, from those Pinot Noirs, and the long, lingering finish, from that volcanic soil. Burgundy is a great place for Pinot Noir with all the limestone and all the other characteristics of the minerals in the soil there, but you don't have, those sort of richer, penetrating flavors that you get from the Pinot Noirs that are grown, in various places from volcanic soil.
Hey, so Kevin, I actually did a little bit of a background, and you probably are familiar with all these aspects, but some of the characteristics of volcanic soils is it's finely grained, it retains and reflects heat, it drains well, and it holds water well, and it has a lot of rich nutrients, like you were mentioning earlier: iron, magnesium, potassium, calcium. It's and I've read somewhere that maybe it was fighting off phylloxera better than other parts of the world because it's so infertile that the microbes could not grow in the soil. So it's better. So a lot of them have kind of, I guess, original rootstock, which maybe also part why the wines are so dynamic very frequently.
Yeah, God, there's a great thought I just had that I hadn't thought of before. Now I've promptly forgotten it. No, I'm not drinking tonight. So, but it was about volcanic soils. Oh, the color of it.
Yes.
And so this is a fascinating part in terms of how grapes mature.
Yes.
And obviously the sun is up in the sky, and directing heat down into vineyards.
Yes.
Okay. So that's where we think of as where the source of heat is. But when you've got things like slate, which is dark, volcanic soils, which are typically dark,
Yeah.
the sun hits those soils and reflects back up through the vines.
Yes.
And so you have, in my opinion, from what I taste of the wines in these areas,
Yes.
is you have more even ripening of the grapes
Yeah.
from those areas than you do where you basically just, have sort of regular farm type soils which just absorb the heat and don't reflect it back up through the vines. And one of the more fascinating examples of this, although it doesn't, it's not directly connected, to the actual color of the rocks on the ground, but the Rheingau, to a lot of people, it's just another German wine region. But the Rhine River, which most people will think of, it starts in Switzerland and flows north to the North Sea.
Yeah.
Well, it pretty much does, directly north.
Yeah.
But you've got this 15-mile stretch that's directly west of Frankfurt, where it turns to the west, goes west for 15 miles, and then turns north again. And all the vineyards are on the north slope of the river. And the sunlight, so you've got all the slate in the vineyards of the Rheingau to begin with that will reflect the sun up through the vines. But as you're standing in the vineyards at midday, you will see a reflection on the river as the sun hits the river, and then also reflects heat up through the vineyards. Yeah. And so that's another fascinating part of all this, to see just how all this works and location by location.
Yeah. Well, somebody said magic in the glass, and I think you just described it, how that process, gets to that point.
Yes. Yes.
So some of the most famous regions we just talked about, Mount Vesuvius in Campania, that makes Aglianico, which is they call it Barolo of the South, even though it's a grape that I think it's still finding its way. But when it's made well, it's long. Well, that's another part of the volcanic soils, is they frequently make long-aged wines. Also, that's one of the aspects that I, at least read about.
Here's my my guess about volcanic soils and longevity of the wines is, the vines have to dig so deeply in those soils that the grapes are just filled with all this dense mineral content. Yeah. And that will help how long these wines will age. There are terraces from the most prestigious area of Aglianico growing in Campania is this little village called Tarsi, which is in this little basin with volcanic ridges all around it. Yes. And Tarsies will age beautifully for 30 to 40 years. Yeah. And a lot of people in southern Italy, they wouldn't even dream of opening a Tarsi, until it's at least 10 years old. And it's not because it has too many tannins or all that, but they just want to wait for the magic that that area can create in its wines.
And just Mastro Berardino is probably the most known producer from that area. Just to give a note, in a tasting maybe done within the last couple of years, their 1928 Torresi got 95 points. So about a wine that was 90 years old at the point it was tasted at, and it was still drinking spectacularly.
Yeah, I love the wines. Unfortunately, Aglianico is just not really reached a level of prominence as Nebbiolo and Barolo or Pinot Noir and Burgundy, but it makes extraordinary wines. They're very food friendly too. I get a huge amount of food pairing ideas out of every Aglianico that I have.
Well, and so just kind of go with that. Sicily, probably the most famous volcanic wine in the world. Mount Etna. So obviously they're known for their Etna Rossos, which is based on Nerello Mascalese grape, or Caricante, the white grape, the Etna Biancos.
Nerello Mascalese is interesting in that I described earlier that I have some examples of Pinot Noirs that are grown in soils with some volcanic content in it, either in southern Pfalz or in, southwestern Germany, in Baden. But Nerello Mascalese, in my opinion, it has some elements of Pinot Noir and it has some elements of Nebbiolo. Yeah. And so, I already earlier described that volcanics, characteristics in a soil can make Pinot Noir come alive. And in my opinion, it really makes the Nerello Mascalese come alive too. And you can do some blind tastings of Nerello Mascaleses from Mount Etna, and people are like, "Is this a Barbaresco?"
Yeah.
Or is this a Pinot Noir?
Yes.
And maybe it's because people don't drink Nerello Mascalese all that much, but I mean, to me, it'd be almost like a blend if you blended Nebbiolo and Pinot Noir together. And that's what's fascinating about it, because you've got, the different characteristics of the grape and then the environment in which it's grown, which then adds to the complexity of all that. Go ahead.
I found a Pinot from Mount Etna. And when I was tasting it, I was like, man, it tastes a lot like Nerello Mascalese. So
yeah. Well, that's because they're very similar. I mean, they have no genetic connection, but they're very similar in how they express themselves in terms of flavors and aromas. But and I do know that people are starting to grow Pinot on Mount Etna, and I mean, this whole business is actually kind of funny because everybody wants to make a little bit more money here and there, and they know that the world knows Pinot Noir a lot better than they know Nerello Mascalese. And it's Pinot Noir is probably a bit more pronounceable than Nerello Mascalese. And so yes, there are people on Mount Etna that are starting to plant vineyards of Pinot Noir.
Interesting. I mean, I think these wines are spectacular, and the funny thing about them is it's really, from the way I understand it, it's really like 20 years ago when they had the big kind of investment rush to Mount Etna. Before, it was just like, a bunch of poor farmers making, sitting on like, gold, basically. The soil is gold. They didn't know about it until kind of like some of the more affluent producers from other, like from Bordeaux or from Tuscany started buying up land. And slowly but surely, the prices of these wines are going up. And they're fascinating wines.
Yeah, and another interesting part of that, we talked about the characteristics of volcanic soils, where they're very dense, and the phylloxera bug, was not able to get into them. And you mentioned Mount Etna at one point was, just this poor farming area. And what people have found are these old abandoned vineyards with like 150-year-old vines, and they've resuscitated them, and they've taken the rootstock from those vines, and then replanted vineyards with this ancient rootstock, and they're making extremely expressive wines. That's what's just so much fun about this. I mean, just to explore and to have all these different experiences.
And just to kind of go quickly, maybe about some of the. I mean, it'd be fun, I think, to discuss a lot of these regions in details, maybe separately. But like Assyrtiko from Santorini, which is different than Assyrtiko from, I think, mainland Greece, but it's I think it's a noble grape. Everything that I've tasted is absolutely spectacular. It's obviously volcanic soil surrounded by water, so you got this combination of the salinity and minerality that's just off the charts. I think I don't know if you don't have Assyrtiko in your catalog, but I don't know if you've had before, and kind of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, it's all Greek to me with the Greek wines, because unfortunately I have not tasted Greek wines in a long time.
Yeah,
I mean, the original idea of what I'm doing is just to explore almost every wine region in Europe. I just haven't gotten to Greece yet. But you mentioned with the salinity that you get from a wine that's grown near the sea, and that is another fascinating part of this. I have some wines from Abruzzo on the east coast of Italy, where the vineyards are all within 5 to 6 miles of the Adriatic, and you smell that salinity in the wine.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some interesting, minerality in the soil in Abruzzo too. A combination of granite that's washed down from the 7,000 to 8,000 foot peaks that are, themselves only like 12 to 15 miles from the sea. And then you get all this salinity, and it's a really fun, fascinating expression, and particularly the white grapes in Abruzzo.
Yeah, we could go on that. So, just a few more references. So, Canary Islands, also famous for the volcanic soils. Madeira, the Azores Islands. So, a lot of the islands have volcanic activity. And then even going something local like Mount Veeder in Napa, which got some volcanic activity and makes some really intense wines. But, I'm right here. I'm drinking, for today's show. I'm drinking Ufark from Somlo, which is in central Hungary. So obviously Tokaj, it's also famous because it's got, I think I read 400 volcanoes lined up. So it's like a lot of just volcanic activity. And it's funny as a side note how like a lot of wine activity, it's trendy. Recently, I've heard somebody say something to the effect, "Oh, I didn't even know that Hungary made wines," which is like a funny statement, right? Because from like 17th to 19th century, these were the most famous wines in the world. I mean, all the royalty were drinking Hungarian wines, and now it's kind of like, oh, I think I thought it was the world ends after Bordeaux and Napa. It kind of situation, just fascinating.
Yeah, 200 years ago, Tokaj from Hungary was the most expensive wine in Europe.
Yeah. 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 And, well, the royalty, I think, on their deathbed, they were drinking it because they thought they were like magic elixirs.
Yeah.
So, but this one is not from Tokaj, it's from Somlo, which is the smallest appellation in Hungary. And the Ufar grape. So I've never been to the area. The way I understand it, it's like a flat land, and then there's like a big hill. There used to be a volcano, and Ufar grows on that hill. And it's fierce minerality. When I drank it, the minerals just jump at you. Frequently the fruit kind of jumps first at you, and then the minerals kind of lag on the finish. Well, this is like the minerality hits you first, and you're just kind of looking for fruit. It's just like a nice wine that you could have, I think, with like meats. It's so fascinating and it's so distinctive. So I for our discussion, I'm like, well, I'm going to pull something like, geeky as something from the soils that I love, which are volcanic soils.
Mm-hmm.
But then let's go to your favorite soils, limestone.
Yeah, so, as I described on some of the calls, I like to cook. And one of the principal criteria for me in selecting wines is all the food pairings I get. If I don't get a lot of food pairings, I do not select the wine. And I'm looking for wines that bring out the flavors in food, and I'm also looking for wines that have a lot of versatility in the food pairings. And where you get that from particular mineral composition in the soil is limestone. I mean, limestone, it just seems to, I described it earlier as kind of a granite, which refreshes your palate, which in itself is good when enjoying it with food, because, after each bite, you will, have a sip of a limestone infused wine, and it's refreshing. It complements the flavors of the food. It accentuates the flavors of the food, but also refreshes your palate where you want that next bite. And then you want that next sip of wine. Yeah. And you should see how fast I go through a bottle of Chablis. I mean, you cook some nice white fish and have a sip of Chablis and have another bite, another sip of Chablis. It's like, whoa, where'd that bottle go?
Why not go from from village level to premier cru Chablis?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting the way the appellations have worked in Chablis, because, it looks like this kind of like crazy quilt of like, well, why is this a premier cru here? And, why is this a Grand Cru over there? And it's directly related to the limestone concentration in the soil. And somehow they've figured this all out, over the years. And the main Chablis or the Chablis hierarchy is you have Petit Chablis, which is typically the ridge tops. Where there's not all that much mineral content on those ridge tops. And then you've got village level Chablis, or just be AOC Chablis, and it's as you start going down those ridges towards towards the valley floor, but then in areas where there's more significant limestone deposits, the beginning level of that is you have what are roughly 40 premier cru vineyards. And then in the area with the most significant limestone deposit, which is actually directly across the river from the village, it's these perfect south-facing slopes, is you've got 7 Grand Crus. And those have the highest amount of limestone. And these classifications were made about 200 years ago. And so somebody had figured all that out 200 years ago as to where you get different flavor characteristics from different parts of Chablis. And I have a fairly obsessive and nutty group of winemakers anyway. They're fanatics about being out in their vineyards every day. And my Chablis producer, he's a great guy, but he apparently knows what the grapes taste like on every vine in his vineyards. And so he creates these little special cuvées. There's this one really fascinating part of one of his vineyards where you get all these appley notes in his Chablis that's similar to what you would get from a really, really expensive champagne. And so he's created a special cuvée. It's still just what you might call a village level Chablis. It's not a Petit Chablis, but an AOC Chablis. But it's just all these expressive things that you don't normally taste in other Chablis. But Chablis is mainly an area of limestone. Burgundy is an area of limestone. The Upper Loire is definitely an area of limestone. Sancerre, Puy-sur-Loire across the river where you get Puy-Fumé. Other areas, down the Loire, you get a reasonable amount of limestone. The Cabernet Francs from around the Chinon, Bourget, and Saumur area, you've got an interesting combination of compressed limestone, which is in the area called tufa, that you've got some richer, deeper flavors, but you still have the refreshing aspects that I've described earlier about the limestone. And then down near the sea where all the muscadets are grown. You taste the same thing. This is from all these alluvial river deposits that have been deposited over eons by none. Where the muscadets, which are grown from Malone to Bourgogne, are grown.
And those are actually muscadets. Sometimes you almost feel like you're licking limestone. They have such minerality to them, but they're surprisingly frequently a lot of them could age longer than Sancerres. You could have some of them 8-10 years old, and I know frequently Sancerres, many times you should drink them within 5 years.
And this is just my personal opinion, but I don't think Sauvignon Blanc is a good aging grape. People are drinking it for its freshness, its expressiveness, and there are ways of making it that can age longer. But Malone de Bourgogne is related to Chardonnay. Chardonnay can age for a long time if made properly. For my birthday last year, I had a 20-year-old white Burgundy, And frankly, or sadly, it was my last bottle of that particular wine. But it's like, it's like it could have aged for another 10 years.
Yeah.
So the muscadets are thought of as something, though, it's just this light, refreshing thing that you eat with fresh seafood. But, they will age for a long time if you make them well.
Yeah. The characteristics of the limestone wines is pretty fascinating. I mean, I know you had on the list Cahors, which is, Malbec area, but it's completely different expression of Malbec than the Argentinian Malbec. And probably the soil has something to do with that.
Yeah, so I don't know enough about the actual geology of why this happened.
Yeah.
But surrounding the area of Cahors in southwest France, there are these limestone plateaus that some geologic event pushed up out of the earth. And in my opinion, the Malbecs that are grown up on those plateaus just sort of like burst in your mouth with all this flavor and this like palate refreshing characteristics. The Malbecs that are grown down in the river valley, they're sort of like denser and more one-dimensional, and you get more of the tannins out of them. Where the ones that are grown up on the ridges, similar to, this is not limestone we're talking about, but it's similar to the situation. Napa Valley. You mentioned Mount Veeder. On the east side of the valley, you also have Howell Mountain, which was an old volcano. So the grapes will express themselves much more differently based on being at higher elevations where there's more mineral content in the rockier soils. Mm-hmm. Cahors, you will make, in my opinion, the Malbec, you sort of come alive and be more refreshing in its expression. Another interesting area where you've got quite a bit of limestone is the Ribera de Duero in northwestern Spain, where mainly Tempranillo is grown, although people are adding Bordeaux varietals such as Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot to that. But this is an old seabed, and limestone is often found in all these old seabeds. In my Ribera de Duero, producers' vineyards, walking through, you still see, broken up old seashells, and this is about, a mile north of the Duero on a hill that's, slopes up to a ridge. But, you've got a combination of, limestone in the vineyards. There also is a lot of, not volcanic, but iron content in that particular section of the Ribera de Duero. And I already mentioned Burgundy, where you've got the combination of limestone and iron, in Vosne Romani. And even though we're talking about Tempranillo in the Ribera de Duero, I can taste similarities into how that Tempranillo expresses itself versus, how the, Pinot Noir expresses itself, in Vosne Romani.
And how different Tempranillo is in Ribera de Duero versus Rioja.
Yeah, Rioja, it almost looks like, the sand dunes of New Mexico.
Yeah.
There's just this, vast kind of sandy river bottom area that stretches for about 40 miles from Logroño on the east, to Aro on the west. And it's just these, almost sand dunes, that people, grow little vineyards in here and there. And I think where they selected to grow vineyards are the areas where they found more minerals in those sand, in all that sand. But the wines from the Rioja are typically, lighter and, in my opinion, less expressive. And the wine, all Tempranillo. But in the wines from the Ribera de Duero, again, all Tempranillo, they've got richer and deeper expressions to them.
Man, it's just fascinating, to kind of to wrap this whole conversation up. Such a great conversation. But you were mentioning how Domaine Romanée-Conti, which makes probably the most expensive wines in the world, how it's on a particular plot of land, and it's really that land that's makes it so reputable. And basically, their wines are you have to play with gold for them. And I heard similar things about Chateau Petrus. That within Pomerol, their soil mix is just so specific. That's where their wines are more expressive than just about any other right bank wines. So it's just, yeah. I don't know if you want to add to that, Kevin.
Yeah, in fact, Petrus is interesting. It is pretty much the highest point in Pomerol.
Yeah.
And again, it's this little knoll that's all limestone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and their wine, I believe, is always 100% Merlot.
Yeah.
And Merlot, the movie Sideways turned it into a joke, and Napa Valley turned it into a joke too. You had a little wave of Merlot. It was like the red Pinot Grigio for a while, and then everybody like overproduced it, and it was awful. And so people were like, "Oh, Merlot, that's just terrible." Oh, really? Well, Petrus sells it for $3,000 a bottle.
Yeah, Cheval Blanc,
Yeah. In fact, one of the more fun wines in my portfolio is I have a producer that's just a cru Bordeaux or Bordeaux Superior producer, and it's only actually about 8 miles from Pomerol, but it's on the south bank of the river in a region that's called Entre-deux-Mers, but this guy mainly grows Merlot, although he grows a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon. And the vineyards are right on the riverbank. And this particular river, the Dordogne, is the river that branches to the north from the Gironde that comes in from the Atlantic Ocean. And the Dordogne has its source up in what's called the Massif Central in the center of France, which again is this big area of granite mountains in the center of France. And the vineyards of this particular producer in Entre-deux-Mers on the south bank of the river are these big undulating gravel banks that is essentially deposited material of millions of years of rocks that have washed down from the Massif Central. And he, as I described earlier, he mainly grows Merlot, which people think of as kind of a joke. And the other thing he likes to do is vinify and mature everything in stainless steel. So first of all, strike one against it is Merlot.
Yeah.
Strike two against it is stainless steel. You obviously need all those new oak barrels to make wines taste like anything. But this wine has been incredibly successful, but not one of my clients will either tell people that it's Merlot or that it was done in stainless steel. They describe it, oh, I've got this really rich, bright, expressive Bordeaux. And they're like, oh, cool, that's great. And they have no idea that they're drinking Merlot that was made in stainless steel.
Wait, hey, if you make good wine, you should make good wine. So I think, Kevin, we have to wrap up because I think we're going to be cut off after 1 hour. But man, this was such a fascinating discussion. We didn't even talk about chalk or clay or sand, but it's just so many fascinating wines, and just part of the whole adventurous drinking experience. Kind of like our motto, drink different. So I think thanks for shedding the light on all these soils and how they express themselves in these beautiful wines.
Well, I'm happy to share my experiences.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Good night, Igor.